So before we jump into using the pickup sticks, I wanted to take a moment to talk about how I like to tie on to my front apron rod. Tie on and winding on are really, really important parts to having successful weavings. If you're tied on kind of sloppily as you weave, it won't be very fun. It won't look very good. So I'm going to show you a few tricks that'll help for a really clean tie on. So I'm going to grab a couple of rubber bands, and I'm making sure my apron rod is coming up and over the top of my loom. And then I'm going to pop those rubber bands onto the heddle. Stabilizing between the heddle and the apron rod just takes out this wobble element, which is really helpful when you're tying on. So when I tie on to my front apron rod, I always work in 1-inch bundles. Today I have my loom threaded in a 10 dent heddle, and I'm working with 10 ends per inch. So I'm going to begin by grabbing 10 warp ends on my right side. And when I grab the 10 warp ends, I'm making sure that I'm getting consecutive ends, meaning hole, slot, hole, slot, hole. I never want to split the slots and holes because you start getting this lattice work look, and then when you tie on and start to weave, you're going to be meeting some resistance as you go, and it's not going to be a clean tie on. So again, I'm taking the first 10 ends on the right side, splitting them in half in groups of 5, and I think of these almost like pigtails, and then I bring those over the top of the apron rod and then to the outside. And now those 10 threads can join together in the middle. And I'm going to go like I'm tying my shoes. But before I cinch down, I'm going to bring one tail through this opening a second time to create a surgeon's knot. I'm not overly concerned with how tight this bundle is at this point because later on I'm going to even up all of the groups. And now I like jumping over to the left side. And again, I'm going to grab 10 total ends, split in half, 5 and 5. I do also make sure that I comb between those slot and hole yarns and eliminate any tangles that might be there. I'm going to bring my pigtails up and over the top of the apron rod. They're going to come under and to the outside. And then again, I go like I'm tying my shoes, but before I cinch down, I bring one tail through for a second wrap to create that surgeon's knot. So part of why I like to work side to side is if I don't have my rubber bands, if I've connected both the right and left hand side of my warp to the apron rod, it will stabilize that rod so that it's not shifting on you. The other reason I do it is I always want to make sure that my outermost threads, which are called the selvages, are in a true 1-inch bundle. When you're weaving, you're not always going to be weaving at a 1-inch interval. You might hit at 8.5 inches of width, and I prefer to have my uneven bundles land in the center. The center of the weaving will always just kind of follow what your edges do. So making sure your selvages are nice and even is key. So now I just keep going with these 1-inch bundles, jumping back and forth, side to side, making the surgeon's knots. So I'm going to do that now. And once you get in the flow, these go pretty quickly. I don't like tying on in groups that are larger than 1 inch because it leaves room for issues with your tension as you're weaving. And I don't like to go less than 1 inch because then it's just getting kind of finicky because you're tying on such small increments of yarns at a time. I've found that the 1 inch is basically the key to getting successful tension once I start in with the weaving process. Another reason is once you're all tied on to this apron rod and you go to space your warp threads evenly with your header or sheeting, you'll hear both terms. If you've tied on with really large bundles, you'll be having to weave in a lot of extra header to get your warp yarns spaced appropriately. So this helps reduce waste. You're always going to have loom waste when you weave, it's inevitable, but I like to find moments where I can just keep that waste number as low as possible. So now I've completed that final bundle, and I'm going to pop the rubber bands off. And when I put my hand on the warp, it's really slack. So before I start making any adjustments, I'm going to take the extra slack out of the system by advancing all of the warp yarns at once by twisting this front ratchet. I'm just going to make sure that this apron rod doesn't start getting too close to this front support beam. If you find that you've twisted out the slack and there's still more to go, but you can't move forward anymore, you can always come to the back of the loom and take some of the slack out from there. So now when I bring my hand across my bundles, it's feeling more like a trampoline, which is what you want to look for. You want some bounce in there. So now I'll show you why these surgeon's knots are so great. You'll want to go through each 1-inch group and make sure that the tension is the same on each bundle. And with these knots, you're going to take your pigtails, you're going to pull them towards your rigid heddle, and then you're going to pull it back towards your body. As you're pulling back, you want to make sure that you're pulling the slack out into the tails. If you just pull straight back, it won't really switch the tension at all. I'm going to take these tails, I'm going to pull towards the heddle, and you can see the slack coming out. And then as I pull back towards my body, I'm also pulling out on these tails, and you can see the slack exiting here. And I'll do this all the way across, and I just think about pulling up towards that heddle with even tension on each pull. This yarn, because it is a wool, it's pretty stretchy, so you're going to see that, wow, she's really pulling a lot of excess out of there. If you have set up with a cotton or linen fiber, something that's a bit more stable, your bundles might not shift as dramatically as what you're seeing here. The key is just to make sure that they're even all the way across. And if not a lot comes out, that's not a problem. So once I'm here, I've got these long tails. And the reason I've left this much extra is because I do want to add a bow on top of the surgeon's knot. I put the bow on for 2 reasons. One, it makes sure that that surgeon's knot doesn't start shifting as you're weaving. Sometimes, even though they're strong, they do have a tendency to wiggle. And the other reason is so as you wind on to your front beam or cloth beam, these tails aren't getting tangled all around the apron cords or the support beams of the loom. And it looks really nice when you get going. It's like a package all ready to be delivered. Okay, so now that I have all of my warp threads tied on in the 1-inch bundles with the surgeon's knots, I've adjusted all of the tension, everything's feeling good. I'm ready to insert my header or sheeting.